Mark, after 17 years, we're eliminating your position. That was the sentence that ended nearly 2 decades of loyalty. My boss Daniel didn't flinch when he said it. Vanessa from Human Resources sat beside him, arms folded, already holding the paperwork. Clean out your desk by end of day. His tone was cold, final. I nodded once, calmly, and said, I understand completely. That was all. No protest. No questions. Just silence. They had no idea what was coming. My name is Mark Caldwell, 54 years old, Senior Systems Analyst at Meridian Technologies in Columbus, Ohio. Until that Monday morning, I had been the backbone of the IT department. 17 years of late nights, server crashes, system migrations. I was the guy they called when everything broke. The man who never missed a deadline, who trained every new hire, who carried the knowledge of the company's digital skeleton in his head. And in less than 5 minutes, Daniel erased me. I walked out of his office without looking back. On the floor, younger employees glanced up, then quickly down at their screens. Some whispered. Some avoided my eyes altogether. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't understand yet. Back at my desk, I began to pack slowly. A family photo. A coffee mug my daughter made in high school. A cactus that had somehow survived 17 years under fluorescent lighting. Bethany from marketing stopped by, eyes wide with disbelief. She whispered that it was ridiculous, that I practically built the company. I shrugged, said quietly, companies change direction. And that was it. No scene. No begging. Just control. What they didn't realize was that in those 17 years, I had become more than a cog in their machine. I had become the architect of the machine itself. Every audit trail, every hidden credential, every piece of buried code, they all passed through me. I didn't abuse it. I didn't flaunt it. I simply built it, layer by layer, knowing exactly where the cracks were, where the pressure points lay. And when Daniel thought he was cutting me loose, he was really cutting loose the one man who knew how fragile it all was. At home that night, my wife asked what happened. I told her the truth. They eliminated my position. She asked if I was angry. I told her no. I wasn't angry. Anger is loud, messy, reckless. What I felt was colder, clearer, focused. I told her only this. Wednesday will be fun. Because by Wednesday, they would learn what happens when you discard the quiet man who knows where every wire runs, every system breathes, every secret hides. The morning after they let me go, I woke up at 6 as usual. No alarm, no commute, just silence. My wife Andrea set a cup of coffee on my desk and asked what I planned to do. I told her, I'm going to work. She looked confused but didn't press. She knew me well enough to trust the calm in my voice. I pulled a flash drive from the bottom drawer. It was one of several I kept, each encrypted, each containing records Meridian's executives had long forgotten existed. Years ago, during a compliance scare, I had been tasked with setting up audit protocols to track insider threats. To do it properly, I'd insisted on off-site backups. Legal had signed off. Then they forgot. I never did. Plugging it in, I opened folders no one else knew existed. Meeting minutes, approval logs, financial statements buried deep in the system. 17 years of history sat in neat, meticulous files. I scrolled until I found what I was looking for, payments to a vendor I didn't recognize. Apex Solutions Group. Registered only last year, with a UPS store as its address. The invoices were inflated. Small enough to avoid suspicion, but consistent. And every approval linked back to one man, Brian Wilcox, the CFO. I leaned back, staring at the screen. The pattern was clear. They weren't just eliminating me because I was old or expensive. They needed me gone before I connected the dots. Daniel, the new boss with his MBA jargon, had been brought in to push me out while the siphoning continued unnoticed. At noon, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Daniel. A voicemail from Vanessa in HR warning me about violating separation terms. They were already nervous. They thought I might talk, but I had no interest in words. Words are weak. Paper trails are permanent. That afternoon, I drove to the bank and opened a safe deposit box. Inside, I placed a second copy of the files. If anything happened to me, Andrea could hand it over to the right people. Then I went home, made dinner with her, and smiled across the table as if nothing had changed. They thought they had removed me cleanly. They thought I was disposable. But they had forgotten the simplest truth about men like me. The quiet ones are always watching, always recording, always prepared. Wednesday was approaching, and Wednesday was going to be fun. By Tuesday night, my plan was already in motion. I hadn't spoken a word to anyone at Meridian since walking out with my box of belongings, but I knew exactly what was happening inside those walls. Executives rely on noise, meetings, memos, corporate spin. I relied on silence. I set up at a coffee shop across town, laptop open, headphones in, looking like just another man between jobs. But on my screen, I was inside Meridian's network. Sloppy work by Jason Phillips, the consultant Daniel had brought in. He thought disabling my account would lock me out. He forgot that I built the back doors myself, years earlier, for emergencies no one else could solve. I combed through email chains between Daniel and Brian Wilcox. At first, it was vague talk about strategic vendors and streamlined payments. But then came attachments, spreadsheets showing inflated invoices from Apex Solutions Group. One entry caught my eye. A renewal license that normally cost $80,000 billed at $96,000. A small bump, but multiplied across dozens of transactions, it ballooned into millions. Every approval bore Brian's signature, and Daniel's emails always circled back with the same phrase, handled. He wasn't just complicit, he was coordinating. I saved everything, encrypted the files, and labeled the folder, Wednesday. That night, Andrea asked what I was doing. I told her only this. They stole from me. Now I'm stealing back my voice. She didn't ask more. She knew better than anyone that when I went quiet, it meant I was working. Wednesday morning came sharp and clear. At 9:15 a.m., I drafted an email from a private account that mimicked Meridian's domain. The subject line was simple: financial irregularities, urgent review needed. I sent it to Daniel and attached just enough evidence to make him sweat. 2 invoices, side by side. One real, one inflated. I didn't wait long. At 9:42, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. Daniel's voice was tight, urgent. He said we needed to talk immediately. I let it sit. Silence was my answer. At 10:05, another email arrived. This one from Vanessa in HR, threatening legal action if I continued contacting Meridian staff. She was rattled. Good. By noon, I drove to the bank again. From the safe deposit box, I pulled another flash drive and added the latest files. Evidence layered upon evidence. Every move documented, every exit covered. They had fired me to erase a problem. Instead, they had unleashed one. And by Wednesday afternoon, they were already realizing the truth. The quiet man they thought was gone was still here, watching, planning, and moving closer. By Wednesday afternoon, the cracks were showing. Daniel had called me 3 times, his voice clipped and restless in each voicemail. Vanessa sent another email, this time more frantic than professional, reminding me of confidentiality obligations I'd supposedly signed. I hadn't signed anything. They were bluffing, desperate to silence me before I spoke to someone who mattered. But I wasn't going to speak. Not yet. Words can be dismissed. Evidence cannot. At 3 p.m., I sent a second email, this one not to Daniel, but directly to Brian Wilcox. The subject line read, "Review these numbers before tomorrow's board session." Attached were 3 invoices, 2 inflated Apex payments, and 1 legitimate vendor contract for comparison. Nothing more. No accusations. No threats. Just the facts. At 3:27, my phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in years. When I answered, a calm voice introduced himself as Robert Chun, a board member I'd worked with years earlier during a system security overhaul. He said, "Mark, I don't know how you got these documents, but I believe you. Meet me tomorrow before the finance committee session." His tone wasn't panicked. It was deliberate. He knew something was wrong. I hung up and sat back in the quiet of my living room. Andrea walked in, asked if I was finally going to tell her what was happening. I told her the truth. They've been stealing. Millions. They thought I wouldn't notice. She asked what I wanted out of it. I said, not revenge. Control. That evening, I organized everything into a single report, spreadsheets, approval logs, email chains. I backed it up on 3 separate drives and sealed one in the bank box. Another I left in Andrea's desk drawer with instructions. The third stayed in my pocket. At 9 p.m., Daniel tried one last time. His voice on voicemail was almost pleading. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that Apex was a legitimate partner, that maybe I was confused. I listened to the message twice, studying every hesitation in his tone. Then I deleted it. His panic was confirmation. He knew exactly what I had. I didn't sleep much that night. Not out of fear, but focus. Thursday morning, the board would meet, and my evidence would surface in front of the people Daniel and Brian couldn't silence. My role was simple: deliver the truth and watch it spread. They thought Wednesday would end with me forgotten, just another casualty of restructuring. Instead, Wednesday had been the beginning of their collapse, and I was only just getting started. Thursday morning, I drove downtown early, parking a block from Meridian's glass headquarters. For 17 years, I had walked through those revolving doors as an employee. That day, I entered as something else entirely. Not staff, not consultant, a witness. Robert Chin met me in a small cafe across from the building. He looked older than I remembered, gray at the temples, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't waste time. I've suspected irregularities for months. What you sent me confirmed it. The board will see everything today. I slid the flash drive across the table. Everything you need is on there. Emails, invoices, approval chains. He asked if I wanted my job back. I told him no. This wasn't about employment. It was about truth. About watching the men who discarded me drown in their own lies. At 9 a.m., the finance committee convened. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. Robert had promised the evidence would be presented, and I trusted him. From a bench across the street, I watched employees file in nervously. Through the glass windows, I saw Daniel pacing. Brian sat stiff, arms crossed, a mask of calm on his face that didn't reach his eyes. By 10:15, my phone buzzed. A message from Stephen, a junior analyst I had mentored years ago. It read, "Police are here. Wilcox and Daniel being questioned. Everyone's whispering your name." I leaned back, sipping my coffee slowly, letting the words sink in. The quiet man they thought they erased was now the reason two executives were sweating under fluorescent lights. At 11 o'clock, another call came. This one from Meridian's legal counsel. A clipped voice told me the board required my presence immediately. I declined. Calmly, I said, "You have everything you need. If anything happens to me or my family, copies go to federal regulators and the press." The silence on the other end was enough. They understood. That evening, Andrea and I sat on the porch of our home, the same place I had stared at the ceiling 2 nights earlier, planning my next move. She asked if it was over. I told her no. This was only the first domino. More would fall. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't relieved. I felt the same cold focus I had carried since that Monday morning. Daniel and Brian had underestimated the wrong man. And now, the company they thought they controlled was about to learn what silence, discipline, and patience could do. By Friday morning, the news had already leaked. Local business sites ran headlines about Meridian Technologies executives under investigation for financial irregularities. No names yet, but the walls were closing in. I spent the morning combing through my files again, connecting threads I hadn't noticed before. The Apex invoices were only part of it. 3 years back, a different vendor name had appeared, Lakeside Business Solutions. Same pattern, inflated invoices, vague service descriptions, no real employees. This one traced to Patricia Wilcox, Brian's wife. The scheme hadn't started last year. It had been running for years, hidden in plain sight. At noon, I met Robert again, this time in a quiet park 3 miles from headquarters. He arrived carrying a manila folder, his expression unreadable. "The board is furious," he said. Brian confessed to the Apex payments once confronted, tried to pin it all on Daniel. Daniel denied everything, blamed the consultants. Jason Phillips' name came up more than once. I handed Robert another flash drive, this one with the Lakeside files. "They've been doing it longer than you think," I told him. He skimmed the printouts inside the folder, then looked up at me. "If this checks out, it's not just termination. It's criminal." That afternoon, Andrea called to say a man in an expensive suit had come to the house asking for me. He said his name was Jason Phillips. I told her not to answer the door if he came again. He was desperate now, trying to find out how much I had uncovered. By evening, Robert confirmed the board had scheduled an emergency session with forensic accountants. My evidence had opened the door. What they were finding was worse than even I imagined. Millions siphoned off over 3 years. Money laundered through shell companies tied to family members. I wasn't surprised. I had lived inside those systems too long to believe corruption stopped at one fake vendor. When executives realize no one is watching, they don't just steal once. They build pipelines. And I had caught them midstream. That night, I stood at my window, watching the neighborhood lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere across town, Daniel was pacing his apartment, wondering how it had unraveled so fast. Brian was drafting excuses for investigators. Phillips was scrambling to cover tracks that no longer existed. And me? I was calm. I had moved every piece into place without raising my voice. The system they thought was theirs was now mine. Their silence would be forced. Mine was chosen. By Monday, the story broke wide open. The headlines finally named names. Meridian CFO and CEO under investigation for fraud. Photos of Brian and Daniel, once smiling in polished suits, now looked strained and hollow on the evening news. Jason Phillips' name surfaced too, framed as an outside consultant under review. Andrea read the articles at the kitchen table, shaking her head. They thought they were untouchable. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence between us was agreement enough. That same afternoon, Robert called. He asked me to come to headquarters. I hesitated but agreed. For 17 years, that building had been my second home. Walking back inside felt like stepping into enemy territory. The lobby was quiet, the usual buzz of employees replaced by hushed conversations. Security escorted me to the executive floor, a place I had never been invited before. The boardroom was stark, long glass table, leather chairs. 10 board members sat waiting, their faces serious. Robert gave me a slight nod. The interim CEO, a woman named Karen from operations, spoke first. Mr. Caldwell, the evidence you provided has been invaluable. Without it, this fraud might have continued for years. She paused, then added, the board has voted unanimously to create a new executive position, Chief Information Security Officer. We'd like to offer it to you. I let the silence stretch, watching their faces. For years, I'd been the invisible man, ignored, dismissed, replaced by flashy consultants. Now they were offering me an executive role. Power. Authority. The very seat Daniel had thought was his. Finally, I spoke. My conditions are non-negotiable. Full audit authority across all departments. Independent budget. Direct reporting to the board. And complete veto power over financial technology decisions. The room shifted uncomfortably. One board member said it was unusual. I replied, so was stealing millions under your noses. I stood, leaving a folder on the table. Inside were my conditions in writing. You have until noon tomorrow, I said. I have other offers. Then I walked out, not looking back. That night, Andrea asked if I wanted the job. I told her it wasn't about wanting. It was about control. For 17 years, they had overlooked the quiet man who kept their systems alive. Now, they needed me more than ever. And by tomorrow, they would decide if they were willing to live with that truth. By Tuesday morning, the decision was made. At 11:47 a.m., Robert called me with the board's response. They had accepted every one of my conditions: full audit authority, independent budget, direct access to the board, and veto power on any financial tech decision. No debate. No compromise. They understood the cost of ignoring me again. At noon, I walked back into headquarters. The same security guard who once barely looked up when I flashed my badge now greeted me with a respectful nod. Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell. It was the first time I'd heard that tone in this building. Respect, edged with caution. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, but the air felt different. People glanced at me, quickly looked away, whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. The ghost they thought they buried on Monday had returned on Tuesday with a key to the boardroom. Inside, Karen handed me the official documents. Your role is effective immediately. The board voted unanimously. She looked uneasy, but determined. She knew this wasn't a courtesy appointment. It was survival. I signed the papers with a steady hand. For 17 years, I had signed maintenance reports, compliance memos, endless documents no one cared about. This signature felt different. It was leverage turned into power. Quiet persistence made official. That afternoon, I toured the IT department. The younger employees, the ones who had once avoided my eyes, now stood straighter when I passed. Stephen, the junior analyst I'd mentored, asked if he should start gathering logs for audit. I told him yes, and that he'd be promoted to lead operations. He blinked in surprise, then nodded quickly. I saw myself in him, a man overlooked, underestimated, waiting for someone to notice his worth. By evening, I sat in my new corner office, the Columbus skyline stretching wide outside the window. I thought about Daniel, probably lawyering up, trying to spin his way out of the fraud he had enabled. Brian, cornered, forced into confession. Jason Phillips, scrambling to disappear into another city, another firm, pretending this never happened. And me, the man they had discarded with a single sentence, now sitting higher than any of them had ever imagined. Andrea called that night. She asked how it felt. I told her the truth. It feels like balance restored. Not revenge, just correction. Because sometimes the quietest man in the room doesn't just survive the storm. He becomes the storm. 6 months later, the company was unrecognizable. Brian Wilcox had pled guilty to fraud, hoping for a reduced sentence. Daniel was still fighting the charges, insisting he'd been kept in the dark, but the email chains I'd handed over told a different story. And Jason Phillips had fled overseas, only to be extradited back within weeks. Their downfall was complete, not because I shouted, but because I waited, watched, and acted at the right moment. From my new office, I oversaw every department that had once ignored me. Forensic accountants dug through years of records, tracing every cent siphoned through Apex and Lakeside. The total exceeded $5 million. Enough to draw federal attention, enough to ruin reputations beyond repair. Stephen thrived in his new role. He managed the day-to-day operations with precision, eager to prove himself. I gave him room to grow, the same room no one had given me. He didn't know it yet, but I was shaping him into the kind of quiet leader who could outlast storms. The staff treated me differently now. Conversations lowered when I walked past. Not from fear, but respect. They knew what I had done, how I had turned silence into a weapon that toppled executives. They understood that I could have destroyed the company completely, but chose to save it instead. One afternoon, Robert stopped by my office. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, and said, "You could have burned this place to the ground." I told him I never wanted ashes. I wanted proof. Proof that silence wasn't weakness, that patience could carry more weight than power ever could. Andrea asked me once if I felt happy. I told her happiness wasn't the right word. What I felt was something colder, steadier. Satisfaction. Completion. After 17 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and discarded, I had reshaped the very structure of the company. And I had done it without raising my voice. On the news, reporters still speculated about how Meridian had missed the fraud for so long. They never suspected that the man they fired on a Monday had been the one holding the keys to every hidden door. I let them talk. I stayed quiet. Because silence had carried me this far, and silence would keep me untouchable. By October, the storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. Brian sat behind bars. Daniel's trial date was set, his name already ruined beyond repair. Jason Phillips was out on bail, waiting for extradition hearings to finish. Their downfall was permanent. Their silence was forced. Mine remained chosen. I still arrived at the office early, long before most executives. The view from my corner window stretched across Columbus, the skyline catching the morning sun. For years, I had worked in the basement of this same building, unseen, unacknowledged. Now, the decisions made on this floor required my approval. The irony never escaped me. Stephen ran operations smoothly, proving every day that he had the discipline to thrive where others had failed. I gave him authority, responsibility, space to grow. He was becoming the kind of leader I wished I'd had at his age. Quiet, steady, unshakable. One evening, as I locked my office, Andrea waited in the lobby. She smiled and asked if I was finally content. I paused before answering. Content wasn't the word. What I felt was balance. The anger that once burned in me had cooled into something sharper. The betrayal, the humiliation of that Monday morning, no longer defined me. What defined me was what came after: the silence, the planning, the execution. At night, I often sat on our porch, the October air crisp, the world quieter than the boardrooms and courtrooms I now commanded. I thought about how close I had come to simply walking away. They had fired me, erased me, assumed I'd vanish like every other discarded employee. But I hadn't vanished. I had stayed quiet long enough to become the storm they never saw coming. The truth was simple. I hadn't won by shouting louder, by demanding recognition, or by fighting them on their terms. I won because I refused to play their game at all. I built my own. Now, when people look at me, they don't see the man who was fired. They see the man who dismantled 3 executives without raising his voice. The quiet systems analyst who turned silence into a weapon sharper than any boardroom speech or legal threat. And as I look out at the city skyline from my office, I know this. Some men fight back loud. Others wait, watch, and let silence do the work. I was never the first kind. I was always the second. And in the end, that made all the difference. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.